And now for more about our domestic manufacturing capabilities and how to build resilience into the supply chain, I'm joined by a panel of experts. Our first two guests served on the National Academy's Committee on Security of America's Medical Product Supply Chain. Marta Wosińska is a visiting fellow at the USC-Brookings Schaeffer Initiative on health policy at the Brookings Institution. She's also a healthcare economist. Erin Fox is a drug shortage expert. She's also the senior pharmacy director at the University of Utah, where they track current drug shortages. And John Murphy is the chief policy officer of the Biotechnology Innovation Organization, also known as BIO. I spoke with all three of them this morning. Thank you all for joining us in this conversation. And John Murphy, I want to begin with you in terms of the shortage of drugs that we have seen. We've talked about the pandemic, which has really shown some of the pressure points when it comes to supply chain. But in many cases, it predates what we've seen in the pandemic in 2019 and 2020. And in some cases, the shortages are 7-8 years. My question is why?
Yeah, so there's a couple of factors, but why don't we talk specifically about the ones that we saw pre-pandemic? So you saw a number of shortages in sterile injectable products, sometimes low-cost generic drug products. And one of the reasons for that is because the product margins, a commercial sale got so low that in order to ensure consistent supply, companies had to consolidate production facilities. And as a result, they became very susceptible to events that could take them offline, that being an FDA inspection that triggered a shutdown and a refiling. You had a good example of Hurricane Maria in Puerto Rico several years ago, which effectively knocked offline almost all of the sterile injectable production that serviced the United States because there was no way to shift production to other facilities. So we have atrophied not just the industry, but more broadly, the manufacturing sector in the United States, a lot of our supply chain resiliency. And it was highlighted very much to the American public during the pandemic. But you're right to point out, this is something FDA and the industry have been tracking and working to manage for several years under a couple of authorities that FDA has to get notified of shortages and to work with manufacturers to shift production. It is not something that has been alleviated by the pandemic, but I do think it has highlighted the need for us to explore some significant changes to the way supply chains are run here for the healthcare supply in the United States.
And Erin Fox, from your vantage point at the University of Utah as the senior pharmacy director, how does this impact the patients and their care? And do you have a sense that pharmaceutical companies have contingency plans if and when there are shortages?
You know, it's very frustrating from the provider's end here at our health system. We don't always know if our order will even arrive. We don't know what to expect. We rarely have information about how long a shortage is going to last. We do a lot of workarounds to make sure to minimize the patient impact, but all of that work is tremendously burdensome, time-consuming, and is getting extraordinarily difficult in the face of labor shortages.
And Marta Wosińska, as you look at this from Brookings and from a think tank standpoint, what should the FDA be doing more when it comes to some of these drugs that might be in the system but not yet readily available? Is there a process to speed it up to help alleviate some of the issues that we're dealing with today?
So FDA has been doing a lot. They really monitor the system as well as they can to the extent that they have the data. They have been trying to improve the access to data that they have so that they can monitor things. A particularly big vulnerability for them are some of the more recent shortages that have to do with demand increases. That's something that is really difficult for FDA to get insight into. So that's an area where FDA will need to continue finding ways to do things.
And let me just follow up on that with you, Marta, and ask about whether or not labor shortages are contributing to some of the problems that we're seeing today.
There have been situations where labor shortages have been an issue. Actually, probably the most the one that comes most to mind is actually Emergent with vaccine production. It wasn't exactly a labor shortage, but this is a manufacturer that was going to be manufacturing vaccines, and they just could not bring on staff that are, they needed highly specialized staff, and they basically ended up having a mix-up. So this definitely was an example of a labor situation. Pandemic also created potential problems with labor, simply because so much of our supply was coming from China and India, and China had a big lockdown. So that's another vulnerability that's related to the supply chain.
And John Murphy, you're nodding your head. I want to talk about China and India because, yes, we are getting more drugs from those two countries. But is that a concern? Is that a problem for the U.S. and for our supply chain and for its customers?
So I think it's a concern in the respect that if they are the sole supplier, it leaves us vulnerable to disruptions, as Marta indicated, in situations where demand spikes or where a natural disaster, or in the case of COVID, for instance, you lost the ability to transport in the early stages of COVID, those raw materials to the production sites in Europe and the United States. So it is very much a concern where we don't have redundancies or at least resiliency and shifting plans in the supply chain. I think that's one of the things that Congress and the administration is looking to alleviate in their executive order on biomanufacturing and bioeconomy. Now, there are other U.S.-centric components of that, but underlying that is also to explore how we ensure that a pandemic event in the future that might cut off supply chains from one facility can be shifted and ramped it up into other areas. It's very much a concern. India, another good example, locked themselves down and restricted exports to certain COVID therapeutic products early in the pandemic to serve their own needs. I suppose one could understand that from a nationalist standpoint, but them being the only supplier of things like propofol for ventilator access became a harbinger of problems to the rest of the world when that happened.
And Erin Fox, my wife is a nurse at the largest hospital in Northern Virginia outside of Washington, D.C. She is dealing with some of these shortages. She talks about it on a regular basis. And my question is why? Why in the 21st century we're still dealing with even some basic drugs that patients need? And as John indicated, some of these hospitals have to make sure that they can ration that medication to make sure that they can treat their patients.
That's right. I think it actually comes back to something that John talked about, how, these are low cost drugs and there's very little resiliency. When one company makes a product and another company has a shortage, there really isn't room for another company to truly make up all the difference. And, we see this in the most basic of products, things like lidocaine, things like sterile water, even, it is very frustrating. And we also see medication errors and, nursing shortages are there. I'm sure your wife feels that. Pharmacy shortages are there as well. And so the amount of training and education to teach people how to use something different in hospitals is very time consuming and risky for patients. It would be much simpler to be able to purchase the products we need, but at the same time, the manufacturers just aren't stepping up. Certainly, I'm sure they're manufacturing what they can, or even manufacturing to their contracts, but clearly it's not enough. And as Marta pointed out, these supply spikes are also very difficult to manage.
And Marta Wosińska, as we heard just from Erin earlier, it is a public-private issue. And so when you look at this from a public policy standpoint, what Congress has done, or maybe more importantly, needs to do in the next Congress, what are the priorities?
I think what's really important is to recognize the sheer size and complexity of the drug supply chain and the need to prioritize. We have thousands upon thousands of supply chains, 20,000 approved drug products in the US, 13,000 facilities that are registered, make API or finished dosage product, and we're not even talking about inactive ingredients. So this is also not something that companies can take on themselves. There are economic reasons why we have this problem. Just-in-time manufacturing is very much driven by economics. Going to outside of the United States to produce is another reason it's an economic reason. Making massive facilities so that the average cost of production is really, really low. That's another economic driver. To have a resilient supply chain, in a sense, goes against sort of profit maximization. And so there's a huge role for government to either provide sticks or carrots and incentivize that, which takes me back again to prioritizing because it's so big. So I really do think that we should be going back and, for example, reassessing the essential product list, which I think is missing a lot of really key products that are important from a public health perspective. For example, we're not paying attention to inactive ingredients and where they're produced. We also need to be thinking about financial incentives and how to incentivize companies. So those are some of the things. So actually, just one more thing I was going to say. In terms of Congress, I think there's a huge role for Congress to really fund ASPR. ASPR is in an incredible position to be doing a lot of these assessments and and helping Congress figure out what they really should be investing in. We only have so much money to go around. This is going to be expensive. And so funding ASPR would be the very first thing that I would be recommending. If we're thinking about onshoring, we really should know what we should onshore. And we need better analytics for that first.
John Murphy, the word of this conversation continues to be resilient. So I'm going to go back and ask you to define exactly what that means. And also to that point, are these pharmaceutical companies doing enough to anticipate where there may be some of these shortages in order to be resilient?
Yeah, so I think, what does resilient mean? I think resilient in a perfect world means a situation where where the demand can facilitate an immediate shift in surge for that new demand. So you have the ability of a supply chain to pivot in a way that goes from cost of day-to-day production to move over to assess and take care of demand that is unexpected. So on the one hand, you have expected resiliency. You know that at some point you'll have to take a plant offline to do a thorough reboot or a thorough cleaning, and you can shift production. What we have heretofore done a fairly poor job of is anticipating how to respond to unanticipated demand in products or unanticipated shocks to the supply chain. There's a very important shortage of a medical product for pediatric tracheotomy tubes right now. The result of that is because there's a demand on silicone related to the upkeep of chips, microchips and other microprocessors. There's only a finite supply of silicone. And so we have to also have a resilient supply chain that prioritizes human health needs in the case of shortages. And that's why, going back to Marta's point, ASPR and the government have a key role to play here because they can help facilitate the movement of key supplies around where you have unexpected demand, where a microprocessing unit plant may have to be deprioritized because a healthcare unit plant needs to absorb new supply. And I think that is an area where public-private partnerships or the government does play a key role, because you cannot expect the commercial sector to deconflict these priorities all on their own. And then the other thing I'll say in terms of funding ASPR is also ensuring that we have a government that is backstopping supply. So we are not just creating a strategic national stockpile for the sake of saying we have it, but we are managing it in a way so that when we need to go to that stockpile in an unanticipated circumstance, things are not expired. The necessary medicines are prioritized in those stockpiles. And that creates an incentive for manufacturers to keep production online. It creates that backstop for the patient community when that's demand. And it again highlights the role of the government to help ensure that supply chain is resilient by being a purchaser and a facilitator in cases of unmet need.
Erin Fox, I'm intrigued at how you're able to keep track of some of these shortages. You do so at the University of Utah. So quite simply, how do you do that? And from your standpoint as an educator, what have you learned, especially during this post-pandemic environment?
Sure. So we get reports about shortages from all over the country from health systems who can't access something. But we know that there are all kinds of reasons why that could be. So what we do is we contact the manufacturers directly to confirm if it's a shortage or not. Once we do that, we will post information. We also include information about alternatives and safety issues that can come up. We're really trying to focus on helping health systems get through a shortage. Ideally, that website wouldn't exist. I wouldn't be doing any of that work, and we would be able to order all of the medicines we need for our hospitals. But over time, what we've learned is that there is a lot of secrecy in the pharmaceutical supply chain. We often don't know a true reason for a shortage, and having a reason for a shortage helps us figure out how long is the shortage going to last. If the plant is completely shut down, that's a shortage that's going to last for a while, and we need to make very different plans for our patients compared to, hey, our shipment got stuck. It's coming in a week. That's a very different issue. But manufacturers don't really have to provide that information to us. So over the years, certainly have learned a lot about how many trade secrets exist and how little information we actually know about our medicines. In many cases, we don't even know the actual company that truly makes the product because of contract manufacturing.
Marta Wosińska, we talked earlier with John Murphy about the pre-pandemic shortages, but what have we learned during and since the pandemic? Where are the big pressure points? And from your standpoint, what are the lessons learned?
The pandemic resulted in a different set of shortages. Until the pandemic, the typical shortage was one for a generic drug, typically sterile injectable. And those were really resulting from supply disruptions and manufacturing quality problems in facilities. That's been sort of the typical type of a shortage. The pandemic brought to us incredible demand surges. That's been a major change and affecting not really necessarily just the low margin generics. In a sense, the problems to address one versus the other differ, right? To deal with the sort of sterile injectable manufacturing quality problems, you have to be worrying about manufacturing quality and how to address that. And this is not necessarily a technology solution, although it might be. For the demand increases, there's a need for us to figure out how to scale up manufacturing rapidly. And it's a different set of technologies. So we basically have seen a much broader set of issues that came for us to worry about.
I want each of you a final minute with a pretty broad question. Erin Fox, I want to begin with you. What are either the challenges or the opportunities moving ahead, especially in your area, as somebody who's on the front lines of pharmacies and pharmaceutical companies? Erin Fox?
Well, I think a bright spot of COVID is the light that it's shown on supply chains. Before COVID, hardly anybody cared about this story. Very few people really thought about drug shortages. And so I think this is a great opportunity for government change and manufacturers to change. And hopefully we can add that resiliency back into our supply chains.
And Marta Wosińska, the same question to you, the biggest challenges, the biggest opportunities.
Probably about how we think about onshoring. There is incredible interest in onshoring. I've already spoken about prioritizing. We need to prioritize. But even if we decide which drugs, which pieces of supply chains do we onshore, we really need to be aware of the fact that just because we're bringing it onshore to the US doesn't mean that we're going to have a resilient supply chain. The vast majority of drug shortages that we have had so far were caused by manufacturing quality problems in US-based facilities. So assuring resilience and attaching strings to manufacturing quality for things that we onshore, not putting them in hurricane-prone areas, et cetera, is really critical. So we can't just simply onshore even just what's most important. We need to be smart about how we also onshore and what strings we attach to this.
Let me just follow up on that one point. So when it comes to these plants or distribution centers, you're telling the companies what?
So there are two ways to, one is, where you are going to locate facilities, right? If you're going to onshore them. Another thing could be that you potentially will require that they have contingency plans of a certain kind, right? That they have multiple suppliers if we're going to support you and onshore you. You might have to install particular type of technologies to make sure that it's more resilient. So perhaps, you put in continuous manufacturing. So there are a number of ways to basically say, yes, we're going to give you money, we're going to help you build a plant here, but we want to make sure that the plant is built in an area that's less vulnerable and that it's built in a way that it's going to be much more resilient and that you have backup plans in case something were to go wrong.
John Murphy, we will conclude with you, your final thought, challenges and or opportunities moving ahead.
So I think a brief challenge is to ensure that we don't get to Marta's point, so subsumed by this idea of onshoring that we lose sight of the fact that in the healthcare side, patients and the industry is global. And so onshoring and creating a resilient supply chain just for the United States does not help the broader global population of sick individuals in the case of a pandemic or in the case of broader global health policy challenges. And so ensuring that our governments work together coming out of the pandemic and harnessing those things that they understood went right and those things that they understood went wrong to collaborate to ensure that we have sufficient operability of a supply chain globally so that patients in any one corner of the world aren't left in the dust when we inevitably face another global public health challenge in the future.
And we will face that, correct?
Yes, absolutely. It's a matter of time, not a question of if.
Each of you adding such an important perspective to this conversation. John Murphy is the Chief Operating Officer of BIO. We thank you for being with us. Marta Wosińska, who is a visiting fellow at the USC-Brookings Schaeffer Initiative on Health Policy, and Erin Fox, Senior Pharmacy Director at the University of Utah. To all of you, we thank you. And that brings us to an end of our program. A big thank you to Pfizer for its support and for all of the attendees for joining us in this important discussion. And for those of you who may have missed any of the conversation, video from the event will be up on our website shortly. I'm Steve Scully. Thanks for tuning in.